I'm Diana. I'm the Education Officer at the Minster. I'm really pleased to welcome you here today, along with Aoife, Eliza and Helen, my colleagues. There may be other Minster staff members here, but I don't know who they are at the moment. It's a series of online talks, which is part of the Leaves of Southwell Project, which is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And it came about accidentally. We just wanted to do some outreach with people, and it's been we've had an amazing response to it. I mean, 135 people in an online talk from all over the country. It's so exciting. And we're delighted to be joined today by Professor Philip Dixon, who is our Cathedral Archaeologist. He's been with us as our consultant archaeologist since 1981, and he's been the Director of Excavation he's been with us since 1981 and the Director of Excavation since 1991. He's been a lecturer in medieval archaeology at the universities of Nottingham, Durham and Christchurch, Canterbury, among others. He's also been consultant archaeologist for other cathedrals, which include Ely, Lincoln and Leicester, again, and others, I'm sure. So we can't think of anybody better placed to speak to us today about the masons and carvers of the chapter house. So Philip, can I pass over to you?
Right.
I hope everyone sits back and enjoys the talk.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much, Diana. I hate technology, but I've got my fingers crossed over this one. I was asked particularly not to devote myself to the chapter house or to Southwell itself. So what I'm going to talk about is in general about masons, carvers, and how they worked with reference to the work that we've seen at Southwell. But 3 or 4 pictures of Southwell itself, because some of you may not know the strange history of our chapter house. And here we've got a drawing I did which shows the north transept and the chapel, the 2 chapels there. And in the 1250s and 60s, they built a new passageway which stopped there with windows that now look down into the vestry for the baptism at an open air pool. And when we've reopened the chapter house, you go into the passage called the Slipe. Along there you can see these windows and the door there. And that was for total immersion baptism, which by about 1250, 60, 70 was getting quite old-fashioned, especially in the frozen north up here. And when the new Archbishop came in, that's Archbishop Romero, in the 1280s, he said, no, we want a chapter house here. And so it was converted. And the builders had a very odd way of starting, which I can show you here from excavations, which I did last year at the beginning of the year. There's the foundation, and here's the foundation for 2 of the buttresses. And they continued round. And then in between these foundations, there's a piece of very rough walling, which supports, so to say, the windows above. And here I've put together 4 of the gaps of the buttresses, and there you can see the breaks in the masonry, which I've outlined there. So they built the buttresses first. And in this drawing, in dark green, is how they started. They built the buttresses around, and I think they went away and left them for a while to see if they'd fall over, because they had a problem. They were thinking about a problem, the mason there, that he didn't have a central column. And almost all chapter houses in this country have central columns, from the first at Lincoln to the last in the 15th century. This one and Thornton Abbey are the only 2 that clearly didn't. And I suspect that since it's got a stone vault, the masons were rather worried about the strength of the buttresses they were putting up. They worked pretty well, so they got it right. But in yellow is the rather rougher stone at the bottom in the foundations and the finer carving above that they did. And so you ended up with a chapter house. And here I've done a sketch which shows in red the first bits they built, then went away, came back and measured them and said, they're still standing, so that's all right. So much for Southwell. Now, masons, building and drawing. We're dealing with master masons. We're not dealing with architects, because the only architect to the Middle Ages was God. And here we have two images, a mid-13th century image and a late 14th century image of God as the architect. Architect, of course, means chief builder. And so in Christian terms, only God is the chief builder. And you can see that God is using the architect's compass, which we'll see other examples of in a few minutes. I suspect that this man in the chapter house is our architect at Southwell. It's a carving of a middle-aged man with a workman's cap, or rather a tradesman's cap on the top, and a moustache which springs from just under his eyes, which is really quite odd way of doing it. And in a way that I'll describe in other talks, there are 4 of these carvings in different parts of Lincoln Minster. And Lincoln was almost certainly the place where the initial carvers of Southwell came from, because of the similarity between our chapter house carvings of leaves and the leaves on the cloister at Lincoln, which was being built at this time. We have a few images of other architects. This one is Master Mathes. You can perhaps read at the top, Meister Mathes von Regensburg. And here's a drawing in the later, probably about 1485, 1490, by Hans Holbein the Elder. He was master mason of Regensburg, Eichstätt, and Nuremberg cathedrals, and he was the author of our almost only book on how to build things, which is the booklet for setting upright and building a pinnacle. So he wrote a book about making a pinnacle, and I'll say something about him much later. How these buildings were built is really quite well illustrated. Here's mid-13th century, 1244 to 54 is the identified date, and you can see 2 men with a stretcher between them with ashlars on it, about to set up a ladder. Here is a man with on his back mortar in a trough, and above it's being cleared off by a mason here. And here there's a mason with a set square. Here is another one chipping blocks accordingly, and in the middle here is a tread wheel with a man eating a bun, and that is lifting up ashlars directly to the top of the Tower of Babel, which practically all our images, of which there are many dozens in manuscripts, are the building of the Tower of Babel. Here, I think mid-13th century representation of Offa, King Offa of Mercia, building rather anachronistically a stone structure there. And here are people with stretcher carrying up ashlars. An ashlar is the block of stone shaped like, so to say, a large brick, of which fine quality buildings built. And here's a man with a wheelbarrow, typical medieval wheelbarrow with ashlars carrying it around. And at the back, pointing out to offer the beauty of the work, is the master mason with set square and the giant mason's compass. And the master mason is the man we'd call the architect, I suppose, in our days. But as I said earlier, only the good Lord is the architect. And here, in another mid-13th century drawing, is Henry III pointing out the construction of a fine building to the obvious master mason, who has got his set square and his compasses as his badge of office. Meanwhile, men are using a rather simpler lift to carry up ashlars. Here's somebody probably with a plumb bob, squaring things off up there, and up here is a man setting an ashlar. Meanwhile, at the bottom, there's a carver carving a capital. This one, which is mid-15th century, 2 centuries later, shows much the same activity. The two men inside a treadmill lifting a bucket full of ashlars or lowering them. At the bottom below, people setting out and carving square blocks. And here, a pit full of lime, which they're busy putting into wooden troughs. Notice the scaffolding. This would not pass health and safety at the moment. It's got putlog holes, that is timbers put into square holes left in the masonry, and then a simple wooden planked platform on top, while people dance around on the top of it quite willy-nilly. And of course, at Canterbury Cathedral in, when was it, 1175 or thereabouts, the master mason himself, William of Sens in France, William of Sens fell off the scaffolding and had to retire. So here we've got a rare survival in Salisbury Cathedral. This is again 13th century. There is a treadmill surviving with the rope around it going down to a hatch below. There's another one of these, and that's here at Canterbury. And you can see this goes down through a trap there, and winding around the lowers and raises the weight, the buckets, and they can fetch stuff up the 200 feet from the ground using this. So the machinery and what they did is quite well recognized, and we have documents, sadly not for Southwell at all, but for here, for example, Westminster Abbey, 1253. Here's February, August and November, and throughout this period there were between 300 and 275 and 350 workmen on site throughout. That's because Henry III wanted the building built rapidly, and it was very rapid, Westminster Abbey. And the records of payments and so on distinguish a number of quite interesting characteristic tradesmen. We have stone cutters first, and you see that their number is large and gets larger. Then we have carvers, who carved the fiddly detail of capitals and edging and so on. And then we have masons, who are what we would describe, I suspect, as fixing masons. That is, their job was to pick up the stone that the stone cutters had sent up and put it in place. And then we have carpenters, who put up the scaffolding, who put up shoring when necessary for walls and windows. And then sanders, and that's an unusual one. The sander is pretty certainly the timber, the carpenter who actually shapes wooden timbers. So he'd be a craftsman shaping things like wooden barrel vaults. And beyond, quite large numbers and continuous throughout, smiths. And their role is almost exclusively sharpening tools. Then we have glaziers, whose numbers go up and down depending on whether there's anything to be done. And then roofers, who are only employed in August, this week in August. And then beyond, more numerous than the lot, are labourers. And they, I suspect, are the people that one sees in the drawings carrying things backwards and forwards. And they're the most numerous, 150 or thereabouts of them, 130, 150. And that's pretty well half the number of workmen are rough carriers of the material. In the winter, people might work under a shelter, might need to, in fact. And here is a painting of 1680 by Hans Forstermann of Greenwich. One part of Greenwich, now the university, once the Royal Naval College, has been completed, King Charles Block. Here is the chapel of Henry VII's palace being demolished. And there is the mason's wood yard and mason's cover. That's a hut for the works department. And I dug up part of it, in fact, in 1970. A massively built, strong structure it was too. So that's what you'd expect to find, a fairly simple structure for people to work undercover and possibly to work right through the winter doing their carving. Now, one or two of these buildings are actually extremely detailed, recorded in extreme detail. This is the west front of Salisbury Cathedral. And during the restoration work in the 1990s here, they had scaffolding over the whole of the structure. And what you're seeing here is scaffolding, not the modern stuff, but medieval scaffolding, whose position was detected by the holes blocked up in the facade. And rows of holes, such as we saw here. You see, these are the logs put into log holes. These were traced and examined at Salisbury. And they were able to see the lifts, so to speak, that is the series of scaffold levels that were put up during the construction of the building. What they also found in this minute detail of examination and drawing is that quite a lot of these stones had actually been glued together using resin, tree resin, pretty certainly because they'd been dropped or broken or otherwise damaged while being put into place. And this drawing, which I hope you can all see, shows the red dots. These are stones which have been joined together. The finials replaced after they'd snapped off. And it's fairly uncommon, you see. It's a whole area here with none of these repairs necessary. And it shows that in this area, they were either extremely clumsy or they may have had a disaster, such as a trestle table full of carved stone collapsing, or they may have run out or low on funds and didn't want to have to recarve some of these complicated flowers and leaves and things. So they stuck them back on again in the expectation that nobody would notice, and indeed that they'd survive, as they have done for hundreds of years. And then in yellow, I've put in those levels that they believe were the principal platform levels for the building. And we have zone here, E, D, C, B, and A. I would have started it the other way around, but never mind. This is the bottom layer. You can see scaffolding placed, sometimes in rather odd fashions. This is the timber, so that dropping there so that you could get the whole of the window in, and so on. So we can, by close measurement and examination, quite often discover the precise stages by which these buildings were constructed. And the Salisbury example gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, possibly 9, which rather fits quite well with the supposed finish between 1244 or 3 or 4 and 1257, which allows us a little time between the annual work on this building to get it finished in time for its consecration. We can actually see these things in reality, as it were. This is not a cathedral, it's the great tower of Newcastle Castle. And if you have a close look at the coloration, you can see variations in the height of the blocks and in the color of the blocks running across. And these are annual layers, because beyond about 10 or 12 feet, using medieval mortar, you couldn't really, or shouldn't at any rate, build any higher because of the squashing of the mortar and the possible collapse of a wall if you build too much. So the estimate is generally between 9 and 12 feet per year between spring, just before Easter, and after Michaelmas. So a building season that lasts in general somewhere between mid-March and mid to late September, after which it gets too wet and too cold for the lime mortar to set and go off properly. This corresponds with the payments at Newcastle, because it was started in 1168, finished in 1179, and there's 11 courses up, well, 10 courses up to there, and all of this is Victorian at the top. So that fits, lacking 1 year, which was around here, which was the invasion of William the Lion, King of Scots, who approached Newcastle in 1174. And that's where the Great Tower had got to by that stage. Now, so much for builders. Now we know, we've got a fair idea of how they did it, and it's manpower, lifting and carrying, that is a problem. But we have a problem with quarries, because although some, especially castles, can be built on rocks where you can quarry things, not all were. And here's the problem with the quarries. At Lincoln, with the then chief mason, explaining where he's getting the best stone from to replace rotting and cracked stones at Lincoln Minster. And he has very little problems as long as they don't run out of stone, because it's only somewhere 500 yards from the west front of the Minster. So Lincoln was built largely with stone that was quarried almost underneath it. But Southwell wasn't. Almost all the stone at Southwell, apart from the floors of 19th century, come from the quarries at Mansfield. And here I've drawn in red the likely route that you'd get from there through the villages. The modern road comes up here, but that is a modern road, to Southwell. And the distance is about 17 miles. Overland, almost no roads, just tracks. And that leads to very considerable problems. They almost certainly did not use wheeled vehicles here in the 12th and 13th century. They would use sledges because they had no road surfaces and very rough terrain. And here at the bottom is a model, child's model of a sledge from about the time of the American Civil War, with a couple of oxen pulling it. And above, a contemporary competition in Maine, in the state of Maine in America. They have oxen pulling competitions. And here you can see one contender with his sledge and a pile of concrete blocks and a couple of oxen pulling them. If this was on a road, you probably need at least 4 or 6 or maybe 8 oxen to pull that, because it's being pulled across a level showground and covered in sand, so it moves fairly slickly. But a proper one would probably take a large number of oxen to keep it pulling. For 17 miles, that's approximately, all being well, it'd take probably 2 days to do it, or changes of oxen, because a team of oxen pulling things seldom does more than a mile or a mile and a quarter an hour. And so 17 miles is really quite a long way. So the next thought is perhaps by water. And Mansfield Woodhouse is actually not badly sited for the River Mourne, which flows down here 20 odd miles until it gets to the Trent by the bridge at Kelham, at the A57 bridge from Lincoln, where you could go onto the Trent. And then from there, it's about 30 miles through Newark until you get to Fiskerton. And from Fiskerton, the Potwell Dyke, certainly in Roman times and probably in the 12th century, was navigable, though not by ships. And there you start getting problems. What sort of vessels are we dealing with? There are 1 or 2 survivors. Here's one at Bremen, which is now in the Bremenhaven Museum. This is a probably mid-13th century vessel on the River Elbe. And you can see it being, part of it being lifted. And there's a detail of it after cleaning. And here you can see it in the museum, partially reconstructed. It's lost one side completely because it had turned over, and this side was protected. You can see it's a massively built structure, but not very big. Below, I've put in a sketch of a smaller barge-like structure, which could be pulled or punted along, even a little stream like the Potwell Dyke, possibly as far as the quay that was found by excavation in the Higgins Mead. The far end of Higgins Mead had a Roman period and later quay from which the stone ashlars could be carried. So that's not too bad. And the reconstruction of the cog, or little cargo vessel. They vary between about 30 feet and 80 feet in length. and they vary in abilities to carry material from estimated 30 to 90 tons, and some bigger ones even over 100 tons of material. The trouble is, the bigger the burden they can carry, the larger they are, which means that certain areas of river are difficult to manage with them. You'd almost certainly have to come down the Mourne in a rather smaller vessel, transship to something like this, and then travel upstream up the Trent. All of these things are rather difficult. And this is how you do it, sadly. This is a rather wonderful painting of burlaks, that is, peasants, pulling a barge on the Volga in the 1870s. And you can see the vessel here. There's a rudder there, so that's the stern. It's got a strange bow arrangement, but it's being pulled by 11 men, not all of whom look very happy in their doing of it. And this, rather than horses, would be probably the thing to pull ships upstream along the Trent, because there was no towpath. You just have to get your footing where you might wish for it. So here we've got the issue and the problems, transporting stone. At the top left is an ashlar block, which they vary in size, say 10 inches by 8 inches and 7 inches thick. And it weighs, if at that size, about 23 pounds. Blocks of that size would be 100 to 110 blocks per ton. And a cog, such as the one we've been looking at, the Bremen cog, would take perhaps a 90-ton load and be pullable either to sail or to pull up the Trent. An estimate, Southwell Minster probably contains 750,000 to 1 million blocks of ashlar, equivalent to at least 200 big shiploads of 5,000 ox cart sledges, like these. And an ox sledge could probably take 1 or 2 tons, but might require 6 or 8 oxen to pull it. So we don't know, we have no documents, whether they use ship transport or straightforward 17-mile ox cart pulling. But in either case, it is a major part of the expense of the building. And on 1 or 2 buildings, of which we have records, it cost up to 4 times the cost of cutting the stone in the quarry to transport it to the place where it was to be built. And this means that places like Canterbury and Ely and Norwich and St Paul's, London and so on benefited because they could have hundreds of tons on big seagoing ships fetched from their favourite place in northern France, in the limestone there. So that's the quarry aspect, and I hope that's given you some pause for thought. One of the things I'm going to have to do is actually to count properly how many ashlars there are in the Minster. That might take me a little while, so don't expect the answers tomorrow. And one of the questions that's very often asked of me when I take groups around was, but how did they build this since they didn't have any drawings? And so the question is, did they use drawings for design and then for construction? And something I'm going to start with is, when is a foot not a foot? And here we have got a list of feet measured in millimeters. Before anyone screams, I know they didn't have millimeters, but it's a good way of measuring something for us nowadays. And an Austrian foot, a piece, is 316 mil. The Belgian voet is 273 mil, and we come all the way down. The Prussian foot would you believe it is 330 mil. French foot varies between 324 and 347 mil. That's the Pied d'Angoulême. And the foot of the Vie de Bordeaux is 343. In other words, you can't use a measure. And in nature, it says here, actual foot is about 245 mil, which is nobody's foot here, for a height of 5'3", 280 for a height of 6 feet, which is a little more likely. And then how the conclusion must be that you don't actually build using a tape measure or a length of string or anything like that, unless you are going to have severe problems when your master mason disappears and another one comes across from Belgium with a quite different length of feet. Here's the English calculations, which makes it all really rather tricky. 12 inches, 1 foot, 3 feet, 1 yard, half yard spans, a half yard, a span, and a finger, and 16 nails to each yard, and so on. Some of them we recognize 22 yards, 1 chain, and that's the length of a cricket pitch. 5.5 yards is 1 rod, pole, or perch. But in actual fact, if you go out in the country, you find that land measurers used 15.5 feet for urban, farmsteads, and up to 21 or even 30 feet for land in the countryside. Agricultural, agrarian land could be statute, 5.5 yards. Pasture land could be 21 feet to a rod. And out in the moors for common pasture and commons, it could be 30 feet to a pole. So if somebody says, oh, how big's your farm? And they say, I've got 15 acres. You have to know 15 acres of what in the Middle Ages to know what size the farm actually is. And then it gets worse, of course, because there's cubits and handspans and palms and a digit, 24th of a cubit. A sacred cubit is 6 + 1, 28 digits, and the Roman foot is 296 millimeters. That is to say, in our measure, 11.6 modern inches. So all over the place, until you get down to the meter adopted in France, the circumference of the Earth divided into units of 10. So quite complex. You can now see that using a measure for laying out buildings presents a problem, especially for work that goes on for years, which might involve several different master masons from a variety of countries, for example, Canterbury or Southwell, which have different measurements. And so did they use drawings? Well, here on the left is Laon Cathedral in northern France, with its spectacular oxen sticking out of the top, 1180 to 1200. And here is our first medieval architectural drawing, which is in the notebook, which has survived, of Villa d'Honnecourt. And he used to be thought of as the first architect, so to speak, of which we have records, drawn records. But after 2 or 3 books have been written about him, it's decided he was probably not an architect, but one of these people who goes around drawing things. You can see that he saw the recently finished Laon Tower in his notebook, which is probably about 1220, 1224 or something of that sort. And he put the oxen showing round it, and he drew it in roughish perspective, because you can see these are square things coming out. However, he did do a drawing of it, which is not bad. But when people, as they often do, say to me, either students or people I'm showing around, well, they didn't have drawings. Sorry, they had masses of drawings. They've just not survived everywhere. There are one or two places like Strasbourg and Vienna. Vienna's got 442 sheets of drawings done in the 14th and 15th century of different parts of the building. And here is a parchment. You can see a sheet of parchment, laid flat, cut square, and with details of the west facade laid in. Very beautiful and precise details. Here is Cologne. And it's not a very clear photograph, but the reason is that these sheets of parchment stitched together measure about 14 feet from top to bottom. So this is an enormously detailed drawing. Begun in 1248, and this is almost certainly the layout drawing by the master Gerhard, who started the work, and got up to about that point, and then it was then finished in the 16th century, and it was only completed to its present state by 1880 from Gerhard's original design. And here you can see a detail of Gerhard's drawing. You can see that's really quite a beautiful, really nice drawing, 1240s. Early 1250s, and on top of it you can see the lines drawn of triangles and squares and so on that I want to talk about in May, when perhaps we'll be able to get together again. A number of people, including the great French 19th century architect Viollet-le-Duc, did all sorts of very complicated and clever geometry to try and show how the building was laid out. A hypothetical design. This is how they did it. They drew a circle inside a square and then divided it up from there to halfway point, and the square root of 2 and various things. As this caption says, rather tongue-in-cheek, says that the overlay has been drawn on an equally hypothetical cross-section of Notre Dame, because although Viollet-le-Duc had it drawn for him like this, it wasn't an accurate one. So even if he got it right, they didn't build it that way. So one suspects that the whole of this arrangement is fictitious. We do know rather more clearly how they actually managed to cut the stone, because there survives very seldom, but they survive, the plaster floors that they used, often above the entrances to chapter houses where they had nothing particular to do up there, in tracing floors. So lines are drawn out and shaped, and stones are placed and cut to fit those lines, and then they're put together and assembled in the building. When they're finished, they get more plaster, spread it over and smooth it off and start drawing again. They're not all tracing floors and plaster like this, and this is Clermont-Ferrand in central France, Massif Central, and the roof of the aisle at Clermont is actually flat, and here we've got the east end with the flat roof running round, and they've used the flat roof as a tracing floor, drawing with chisels and compasses and so on, the shapes of the things they're going to build. And they must have taken the stones up here and shaped them up and then put them into the windows and the various buttresses. So they then went away and left them. And one of our friends spent some time putting chalk into the grooves, and then produced these photographs. So this is how you cut stones exactly to fit. So that's how you do it. But how do you do it financially? You may be lucky to have a patron, a Bill Gates, to give you huge sums, but almost none did. This is how in 1294 to 5, which is exactly when our chapter house was being built, the income for this particular year at Autun, the Cathedral at Autun, Saint-Lazare, and these are the ways they got money. Taxes were levied on the chapter. Income from vacant benefices. So if you had a priest who dies and is not replaced from a year or perhaps 2 years, the money that would go to him goes to the cathedral. Income from indulgences. So if you're a benefactor of the fabric, you might get 40 days less in purgatory if you paid for it. Income from collection and synods from the Brotherhood of Saint-Lazare. That's like the Friends of St. Minster. Casual offerings. They amounted to £34, 19 sous, 5 deniers. Incidentally, before we go any further, because there will be some French calculations, the pound is a pound of silver. It's called a livre in France. And we have a pound. And if you think old money, if you can remember that far back, we had pounds, shillings, and pence. And that's exactly what we've got here. £34, 19 shillings, and 5 pence. Denier is denarius in Latin. So denier. And this survives right up to the 1790s when the French advanced towards francs and tenths of francs. The income from the collection boxes for services, £10, 17 and twopence. Additional items, £42, 13 and threepence, deducted from the collections between Whitsun 94 and 95. So there's quite a lot coming from people putting money into the collection box. The total income comes to £443, 2 and 9. The expenditure is interesting. To the quarries for the excavation of stone, £8, 10 and 4. To the same for a year's supply of lime for mortar, £9, 8 shillings. Cutting and transportation of cask wood for the vaulting in the church. This is what Sanders produced, £17, 2 and 7. So you can see there's more going into roofing areas. To the forge, £42, 10 and 6. To the quarry forge, 62 shillings, including £3, 2 shillings for iron. To the labourers for opening the said quarry, £4, 15 and 4 For the labourers who laid the tile of the roof, £1, 9 and 11, poles, rafters, and so on. For the making of 12 carts, including the ironwork, £1, 15. See the people, those are the days. To the carpenters, £8. Repairing the roof of the church, replacing the machinery, £3. Carpenters for lathes, £10. Cost of the lathing, 3 and 6. Nails, 16 fourpence. And here we get the Crelincher. To Master Pierre de Dijon, a roofer, £70, which, as you can see, is a huge amount, and he must have been acting on contract. I will do you this roof for £70. The said Pierre had £12 accounted for. And then we continue part 2 for all this cost. Expenses in moving the stones called gargoyle, £4, 10 and 9, to Reno, the innkeeper, for the rent of a house for the master roofer, for 2 terms in the current year, £3, and so on and so forth. And for horses, shoeing the horses, £4, iron and nails, £6, and so on. Total expenditure, £290. So they actually ended up in profit, carried over to the next year, including 5 shillings for treatment to a horse for a damage, and buying another horse, £3, 10 sous. So now that's the sort of costs involved, and we'll talk about individual masons in a moment. But I just want to take us on to the same sort of period, that is within 20 years of the building of our chapter house at Southwell. And this is a map showing Edward I's attempt to defeat the Welsh, the first attempt, 1277. And for that he was building Ruthin, repairing Montgomery, building Buith, building a castle at Cardigan and one at Aberystwyth. And he required diggers, ditch diggers, carpenters, and masons. And this is where he got them from. And for our point of view, which is interesting, Derbyshire, 300 carpenters, Nottinghamshire, 8 masons, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, and Leicester, under a separate contract, 200 masons, Shropshire diggers, Cheshire carpenters, and a huge number of diggers, nobody from further north, very few people from the south or east. These are locals. And you get, for example, Worcestershire, you get 22 masons. In Oxfordshire, you get 47 carpenters. So what you're seeing here is, on the whole, stone areas, ascending masons, places like Lincolnshire, or the parts of Holland, 300 diggers. So the diggers are coming from the woodland areas, like Derbyshire, 300 carpenters. So that's people selected from a relatively small Midlands area, on the whole, by reason of the larger numbers in those counties of skilled people. And then you get the second series, 1283 to 2 to 3. And that is the building, finishing of Ruthlin, Denbigh, Conway, Carnarvon, Harlech, all the great castles around here, and a much larger number of people. Norfolk and Suffolk, 10 diggers and 20 carpenters. Lincolnshire, 150 diggers and 40 carpenters and 20 masons, 30 masons from Nottingham and Derby, and so on. Huge numbers of people being shifted. And we've got records which would take me the rest of the week to go for, but here we have Flint Castle in 1282, just before the building of our chapter house, while they're already building the slipe. And you can see Master Ralph of Nottingham paid at 3 shillings a week. And he was, then there's John of Bedford, who's his deputy, and other ones at that same sort of price. These are master or highly skilled masons. And then very quickly you come down to all these masons who paid half or less than Ralph of Nottingham. So you can see breaking down inside the lists. But that leaves lots of questions for us, which I hope, by more and more work that I might discuss in a minute, what did the mixing of masons produce? because you've got masons from all over the country who work locally, and they're all coming to work at Carnarvon or at Conwy or Harlech, and learning other people's skills. And then they went back home again at the end of the season. And did they then spread those skills in the years around 1290 to 1300? I've asked a number of colleagues about this without getting the answer any answer at all about what it is. So how can we trace individual masters? And we can, and that's a way. And what is the balance then between the patrons and the masters? So lots of interesting questions to go. And we end up, you see here, with the building of a great tower for St. Barbara, who seems to be drawing the shape of it from a handbook. This is about 1420. There's the whole of it. And I've just enlarged portions of it. So you can see at the top, ashlars being lifted, workmen at the top up there. And you can see below, cutting rough stones, mixing mortars, carrying mortar, carrying shaped stones. And there's a works yard with carvers carving. And here you've got the master with his measure, looking at everything. And here is his deputy, I suspect, talking to three women who've come to view the scene in a cynical sort of way. So I hope this has shown you we know something, but not really enough about how they did it. But you can see how complex the work really was and how much more like medieval work it actually is. Here's a corner of my study, and all the books that you can see here are on medieval architecture, on cathedral architecture and so on, including things like Viollet-le-Duc's complete set of volumes and so on. So there's a lot to be said, and there's a lot to be done. And for a number of years, nearly 20 years now, I've been communicating and working with what I think is one of the most striking people, architectural historians. This is John James, an architect with lots of prizes in Australia for high quality building. But for the last 50 years, he's been measuring buildings. And there he is at shot, climbing up the roof. Here am I helping him or trying to confuse him. There he is at the far end. And here, among many other books, is his great masterpiece, which consists, as you can see, of 5 volumes in which we can find every capital of every one of the nearly 1,200 churches and cathedrals in the central part, the Ile-de-France, arranged in their chronological order between the beginning of the 11th century and the beginning of the 14th century. That is really a rather worrying amount of work. And here's the sort of thing that he has done. Checking, you can see all these little sketches of the shaping of these parts, the corbels, the mouldings, and so on. And they vary across from line to line, showing you how the building, this shot, was constructed. And measurements which are probably geometric rather than arranged, all lead to, here is Ely, for example, the nave of Ely on both sides, showing phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of the construction phase 3, phase 4, phase 5 of the construction of the nave at Ely, which you can tell by changes, minute changes in the size of stones and so on. You can see here in detail, this is Ely. It was built from this right-hand side with coursing along till they got to the arch. And then they stopped building the walling until they turned the arch. And then once they had turned the arch, they started again, but by now with slightly differently shaped stones. So you've got the horizontal eventually maintained, but before that they had to go into all this muddled stuff to get the courses level again. And this shows it was built from the central tower outwards. So, I hope this has been interesting for you, and I'm now going to switch off my PowerPoint and we'll see where we get to.
Thank you, Philip. That's a real different insight into a very different world. I think I was, as a member of staff, working on the Leaves of Southwell Project, which is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. I was particularly interested to hear that a roofer was paid £70, considerably less, I think, than we've spent on our new choir roof recently. I think the Dean's here, and I'm sure she would agree that sounds like a bargain. So there's a huge team of us working on the Leaves of Southwell project, and Philip has been very involved at every stage of it. There's been a lot of preliminary archaeology that needs to go on, and then ongoing during the project as well. So it's been a fascinating experience for us to be working alongside Philip with all that huge amount of knowledge that he has. So we said we'd finish around 3. I'm going to suggest we go for maybe another 5 or 10 minutes, because I don't want people to leave disappointed and not have a chance to ask their questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please either use the little hand that you can see at the top of your screen. That will show us who's asking. If you could try and ask a brief question, that would be great, and then we can get through lots. You can also pop a question in the chat, which Aoife and I are looking at between us. One question already came up, which was about, I wrote it down, from John in the chat, said, is there evidence of masons building dry stone walls in the winter when building on churches, etc. had to stop? And while you answer that, I'll have a look and see if we have any more questions pending.
The straightforward answer is no. I think it very likely that the people who are simply in that list, not stonecutters, not carvers, but actually rough walling masons, had a separate occupation, possibly in farming. And so that masonry work would be a seasonal thing between the end of the frosts and the beginning of the next year's frosts. So it's about 7 months, probably. The carvers and skilled people probably worked all year. And the thing about stone walls is, yeah, I'm sure they turned their hand to almost anything, except that in much of the areas that they came from, they didn't have stone walls. They had hedges, even in the Middle Ages, or no hedges at all. There were almost no hedges in Northumberland, for example, as we know, right into the 16th century, because people complained we need hedges that'll stop the Scots from driving our cattle away.
Thank you, Philip. I can see there's a hand up. Patricia has her hand up, Patricia Hardy. If you want to turn on your camera and unmute yourself. Oh, you have done already. Excellent.
Hi, Philip. Super talk. I was really interested, particularly about the movement of stone from Mansfield Woodhouse Quarry on the River Mourned to the Trent.
Yep.
Now, my home lies within the 2 rivers of the Mourne and the Meaden. In fact, they are within a mile of me. Been a bit worrying lately. But the Mourne and the Meaden come together with the poulter to make the idol.
To the idol.
And the idol flows through Retford and doesn't join the Trent until East Stockwith, which is much further north than the bridge at Dunham, which is just up the hill from me, the A57. So I'm not too sure about that, unless you found a very old map that shows the Mourne flowing in a different direction than to what it does now.
No, it joins and forms the idol, but it's between Torksey and Dunham. While I was talking, I couldn't actually remember the name of the bridge, so I just said the A57. It flows in. We know that the course was changed in the 17th and 18th centuries when they were doing the drainage around there, so we don't know exactly where, but you could get reasonably sized flat bottom barges down. The only trouble with flat bottom barges is you can't load them too high or they turn over. And so you have a balance between load and which is to the advantage of bigger ships.
Okay.
So yes, you're absolutely right, Patricia. Yeah.
Thanks, Philip. Thank you.
Goodness, people's knowledge of rivers astounds me, or people's knowledge of all sorts of things astounds me. Thank you, Patricia. I'll go to Aoife and ask her if she could choose a question from the chat.
Okay, this is an interesting one. How long was a mason's training from Stephen Rogers?
Yeah, that's a good one. Until he could start at the beginning. We know about the masons' training from the end of the Middle Ages rather than the beginning, because we've actually got the written rules from the guilds once the guilds start in the later 14th century and the 15th. So they don't directly apply to what they were doing at the chapter house necessarily, unless they're traditional. And what they had, you remained an apprentice mason until you could recite the methodology of building, for example, a pinnacle. First I draw a square, then I do a so-and-so and so on. You then had to have a master work, which could be any sort of stone carving of, depending on what you want. And you then put that in front of a panel of the local guild who decided whether it was good or not. And so it could take 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, but you had to be able to recite the regulations of the guild. That is, nobody is allowed, for example, to take instruction from somebody who has not already become a master. That's one of the ones from Nuremberg. So somebody couldn't put themselves up as an architect and then hire architects and tell them to do it this way or that way. That was forbidden. The reason for it's obvious enough, that they didn't want anyone undercutting them, and they didn't want anyone building something that fell down, because it would reflect badly on them. So this is, it's quite specific. It has very, very little to do with the masons nowadays, it has to be said. Not that I actually know what the masons nowadays are like, though a friend of mine who joined them did mention it before he died. And they are a long-distant descendant, the modern masons, of actual masons.
Thank you. We'll go for another hand up. Steve Dunn's hand's up. So Steve, if you'd like to unmute. Oh, you have done. Excellent.
Right. Yes, firstly, excellent. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating.
Steve, you've muted yourself, I think, accidentally.
Sorry. Try again. Right.
Terrible, isn't it?
Well, I'm not good with technology either. Firstly, thank you very much. Excellent talk. Until a couple of years ago, I was the head guide at Salisbury Cathedral, so naturally my eyes and ears pricked up when I saw. I think it's probably John Crook's image, isn't it, of the West Front? But the thing that struck me as quite interesting was right at the very end, when you're talking about the sort of an assortment of stonework. If you talk to our current clerk of the works, he will tell you that the further west you go along through the church, through the cathedral, the more randomly appears to be the selection of stonework.
Yeah.
So at the East End, when they chop out a stone and build a template, that template's good for sort of 3, 4, 5 other stones. When they get to the West End, they're making templates almost per stone. And I mean, there's a number of perhaps rather hick theories about that, but I just wondered what your take might be.
Yeah. Are you speaking, Steve, of Pascal? Pascal Miallen,
No. Wasn't Pascal at Exeter?
He's Salisbury.
Oh, well,
No? Okay.
No, the chap I'm talking about is a chap called Gary Price.
Oh, yeah, I know him. Yes, I think it's quite likely. One of the problems at Salisbury is they started slowly and in a decent fashion, as it were, and they I don't know who it was who chose. Was it 1256 or 1257? But they sent out all the invitations to the consecration, and the last stage of the building was done rather more rapidly.
1258, but yes.
58, yeah. And in consequence, I suspect that they worked rather more rapidly as they got to the West Front.
Right. So they were chasing the time rather than
chasing the time.
Yeah.
Because so far as I can recall, you know better than I, there were about 15 bishops and a couple of archbishops at the consecration of Salisbury, and Henry III, and an entourage as well. So all of this had to be booked up months, if not years, in advance. So they had to get the place at least looking finished and the scaffolding down before they all pitched up at the West Front.
Well, thank you. Am I allowed a second question very quickly?
Would you mind, Steve, if we move on?
No,
because I think there's quite a few in the chat.
No.
If you have a burning question, I guess if Philip doesn't mind, you could email it to Aoife and she could pass it on. Would that be okay, Philip, with you?
Yeah. No
Okay, lovely. Aoife, can I go back to you and ask for another question from the chat? And hopefully we've just got time for one or two very quick ones with a short answer, please, Philip.
Okay, so 2 people have asked, is there a connection between York Minster Chapter House and Southwell Minster Chapter House?
Yes.
That was a quick answer.
I mean, the full answer is that York Minster Chapter House was, the funds were got together by the father of the Archbishop who started Southwell Chapter House. De Romero, or Romanus, was the Chancellor of York Minster, an Italian, and he had a son, brought him over, and Romero died, I can't remember exactly when, but something like 1250, by which time he had collected the funds as Chancellor for the building of the transept at York with its great tall windows, is it 5 sisters or 7 sisters or 95 sisters? I can't remember how many windows there are. And he then died, but he'd collected money for the chapter house building. That was about to be started when the Civil War broke out. Simon de Montfort's rebellion against Henry III, and the chapter house at York was only just started after de Montfort was defeated and Henry III restored to power, which was 67. Meanwhile, the son, John de Romero, or John Romanus, had been a priest, a professor in France, various other things, ended up Chancellor of Lincoln Cathedral. And from there he was upgraded to Archbishop of York, where he'd been before, of course. And he got there to find the chapter house at York nearly finished. And it's the next year he decided that Southwell should have a chapter house. And my imagination here, it's only that we don't have specific documentation. My imagination here is he got to Southwell as he did. We know he spent the first year of his archbishopric traveling around visiting places to see what it looked like. He said, "Where's your chapter house?" And they said, "We don't have a chapter house. We meet in that building over there." And he said, "This won't do. You will have to pay for a chapter house," which is when they stopped thinking he was a good thing. But he issued several edicts, which are in the White Book, about, I think they're in the White Book. There's one that says, that insists that the prebends of Southwell have to stump up funds for the chapter house that he has ordered them to build. So there is a connection. I think it's a very close one. And why did he want a chapter house? Because he felt that, well, Lincoln had the first one, and York has just finished one. So Southwell must have one. And the only other chapter house, incidentally,
very pleased, I think most of us are too, that he decreed that we needed to have one, because it's
absolutely
one of the most stunning pieces of architecture that I've ever seen. Certainly, I'm sure many of you would agree. I think we're going to have to leave it there, very sadly, because it would be fascinating to carry on all afternoon, Philip. But I just want to say thank you to you for giving a really fascinating talk, and to everybody who's attended as well. Thank you for your support, and thank you for donating. We don't make a charge for the talks, as you know, but we've experienced a huge drop in donations in the Minster in the last year, obviously, and so we have just invited donations if you're able to. Thank you. You are going to be sent tomorrow by Aoife an online survey. You read it, every single one, very carefully, and it does help to inform our future sessions. So it's really helpful if you could spare 5 minutes to fill it in. And a little plug for the next one. It's on the 23rd of February, and this time we're going to be joined by our cathedral architect, Nick Rank from Buttress Architects, who's also one of the consultants, obviously, on the Leaves project, who's going to be talking us through the conservation that's currently going on in the chapter house. And that's really fascinating. If you do social media, we've been posting most weeks a little update about where we're up to with the work, because obviously people can't come and visit at the moment, and those, you might find those interesting. If you really want to read them all, I'm sure if you email Aoife, poor Aoife, if you email Aoife, we'll be able to send them, all of them, out to you, and hopefully you'll find those interesting. And we've got booking forms already on the events page on the website for that. So finally, just want to thank Aoife for all her hard work with the tech, setting it all up, and Philip for this talk, and obviously the National Lottery Heritage Fund, who have funded our very expensive roof and the conservation work that's going on around the Minster and in the chapter house currently. And hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.